this is Julian from Group 7, and I'm here to walk you through our DEC code to JavaScript translator. So, let's get started. Alright, here we have our main website directory, the root directory. This is all just full of HTML files, pretty standard stuff. I don't think we need to walk you through. I think the most interesting thing to you is how we made our script, our deccompiler.js JavaScript. So, let's take a look at it. Alright, at the top you can see there's a bunch of global declarations of different variables. I'll go through them each quickly. Output is our main output string. Basically, when we do our different translations, we concatenate into it. If you don't know what concatenating is, the definition is technically to link together in a series. In JavaScript terms, it basically means just to add to the end of the string. So that's what we're going to do. First func is a Boolean flag that basically tells the user, or rather the program, when a different function called makefunc has already been called once. It'll be useful to know when certain brackets need to be closed. So we'll see that later down. These two array commands, array operations, they're basically just a collection of important declarations that we will, and command calls that we will see when we actually translate through the code. We'll need it, and we'll loop through it to tell us where certain things are. All right, let's get started. So doTranslate is kind of our main invocation function. It's called when the button on our website is pressed. And this kicks off the program, basically. So over here, output is set to clear again, just to make sure when we run it multiple times that our output screen is completely cleared so that the person doesn't have to reload the website every time. First func is also set to true for the same reason. Var text area value is getting the input from the left side of the screen, the input box. And we're going to call that my text area. And that's just simply getting the input. Lines array, what it does, it goes through our input in my text area and runs split on it. So it takes out all the enters. Our program, I should mention, is actually space and enter key sensitive. So you cannot just throw them in. They are quite important, and all the inputs, just to let you know. So this one splits it into a bunch of different sentences, we'll call it, every time we press enter. And that'll be important for later. Parse input is another function that calls and there's also a very important function. I'll run through that very soon here. But basically, we'll call that using lines array as our parameter here. And that's what it's going to look through. Finally, when parse input is through, we should, at this point, have our full output ready to cook. So we will throw that back into the output text area. And then the user can take that and use it for whatever they need. So let's continue on. Function parse input with a parameter called iArray. Remember, that was lines array from here when we went through all our code and split it into our different so-called sentences. Basically, we'll run a for loop with an index of starting at 0, and it goes to less than or equal to the length of our iArray, which is lines array. And then every time it runs, it adds 1. Pretty basic stuff. So if iArray I is undefined, basically, if we get to the end of our array, we will add a closing bracket. Otherwise, we'll go to the bulk of the code. So what we do in parsed array is for our lines array, remember how we split into sentences? Now we go through each sentence one by one, using the index to loop through it. And we make a new variable called parsed array, which is equal to our input array that is split between spaces. So what this does is in our different lines, we suddenly have a bunch of keywords. So if we had something called dec in 1, 2, 3, that would be dec space in space 1 space 2 space, so on and so forth. And this will split it into an array that contains dec in 1, 2, 3, each as separate elements. After that, we'll run another loop through that parsed array, and we will split it again just to take out any commas that might be in there, and then we'll join it back together with no spaces in between. So that's basically just removing commas. This is a debugging message just to show us what the parsed array looks like after we've run through all this code. Here's another check. Basically, this is a bit complicated. So if the first element of parsed array has a colon at the end, which is seen here as a 2D array, where we take the first element, and because remember, strings are arrays in of themselves, so we can actually treat them as arrays. So once we go in there, we say we get the length of that final one, subtract 1, mainly because when you take a length of an array, it will give you the number of elements in there, even though technically arrays start at 0. Just you need to subtract that 1 for that purpose, just so you can look at the last element and not the one after the last element. If that's equal to a colon, we run makefunc. Using parsed array as our input, we will, input parameter, we'll take a look at that in a moment. That basically means that they have created a equivalent of a JavaScript function. Otherwise, we'll run to this switch case, where we'll take the array commands index of, using the first element of our parsed array. If you remember array commands up top, that was our list of a bunch of important keywords. Basically what it's looking at, it's looking for the first part of each sentence and seeing if they match up with an important keyword up in array commands. And if they do, they'll give us the index of where that is, and then we'll run our switch case depending on what that index number is. So if it was dec, it will give, this thing will give us 0. And then it will run, in case 0, which it should return, it will run our dec function. And it will continue to do this until we are at the end of our code. And afterwards, it should have already given us the full output, and that is that. So let's quickly run through all our functions. Function makefunc, using iArray as a parameter. We have a new variable called temporary, which is equal to a copy of iArray. The first element of temporary is basically slicing off the end, because remember, when we call the equivalent of a function in dec code, it basically means there is a colon at the end of each function call. And we don't want that colon in because that will mess things up in JavaScript. So we slice that off. We have another if check. If, remember this flag, if first func is equal to false, basically if makefunc has already been run before, we need to close this first before we do anything, because that will close our previous invocation of the function. Otherwise, we simply just output it, and that will look like output equals function plus the name of temporary, which should only be equal to 1 length of size, because that's how it works in dec code. Putting the brackets at the end, no parameters, because dec code does not support parameter calls or parameter invocations. And then we will always set first func to false now, because in any case now, first func has already been called. It was true up at the top, now it's false, and will remain false for the rest of the code. Now function dec, using, once again, iArray as our parameter, which is usually going to be parsed array, as up here. We are just going to be basically using parsed array as a common global, not quite global, a common call. If the second element of iArray is equal to undefined, that means there was a miscall. It means that the person probably wrote in dec, but did not write anything after before they pressed enter or they ended the code, which is in an incorrect call. So it calls, in our error case, it will call dec initialization does not contain a name input. So that will just give us an error in the console log. It's useful for programmers and people who want to know why their code did not translate properly. Otherwise, we'll start concatenating again, output plus equals var plus the first element, which should be the name, such as in something called dec in input. We'll have another loop here. We have to be careful here. We call this J because in JavaScript, these indexes actually carry in through. So since we call this index within a for loop up here back in parse input, we cannot use I again. We have to change it to J. Otherwise, it will start using I, and it will just mess up the indexes completely. The index will start jumping to where they're not supposed to be because of our pluses at the ends. So we call this J. Output concatenates each element in J. This is basically if you have a call such as dec input 1, 2, 3. After the first two, which is dec input, everything after will be what's contained within that array. So it will just translate to each. If it's not this is just a check. If it's not the last element in the input section, it will put commas in afterwards just to separate. Otherwise, once you're done, you close the square bracket off, and you are done with that translation. These are all quite simple, and they're all quite similar to each other for move top, move all, and output method. All you do is, once again, we're using IArray as our parameter. Output concatenates the third element of our IArray dot unshift IArray second element dot shift. Basically, what this does is moves the top of one array to the top of another array. So it's an unshift and shift call. Move all is quite similar once again, except we need to use a while loop. So while IArray second element equals length is greater than 0, you unshift that onto the top of IArray1 dot shift. So basically, it will take all of the elements of one deck and put them on top of another deck. Finally, output method is when in deck code the user writes something such as output input, output out1, whatever, the name of a deck. It'll simply write a console.log plus the name of the deck. And that should work in JavaScript. Finally, our large one at the end is called function jump. This is a bit interesting because jump has a kind of interesting way of being called. It uses words instead of operators, so we have to make sure that our words are being handled correctly. So basically, when we look at it, if the second element of our jump input is not equal to if there's no conditional check, if it's something such as jump end, all we simply put out is that function call. That's what it is. If it's just jump end, you are literally just calling a function. Otherwise, if there is a condition call, if the second one had an if in it, that means we need to start checking our conditions. And once again, we use our index of check. But this time, instead of using array commands, we're using array operations. Up here, there's less, greater, equal, empty, not. And we'll run the check, see if that input has anything in here. If it is, it will give us the index. So if that third thing is less, it will give us 0. If that third thing is greater, it will return 1. And we'll use that case for case 0, 1, respectively. And these are all just outputs. That'll output what is needed. And if it's less, it will output less. If it's greater, it will output greater. If it's equal, it will output equal. If it is empty, it will output if the length is 0. If it's not empty, it will output if the length is anything but 0. Continuing on until it's all done. Finally, we have a function error, which simply is just outputs console logs depending on whether there was errors or not in the code. And they're just simply called. We could have probably put it as a switch case statement, but we realized that this was mainly undercode. This is something the user would never use, so we did not put the case statement in. We just simply left it as if statements. And you can see there's a bunch of different error calls. And depending on what the error is, we put that as if statements, such as the one up here, checking if an error happens, checking the conditions for an error. If it is, it outputs a console log. And that is basically all our code. It simply just goes through each of our sentences, so-called in-lines array, parses through them, breaks them up into certain words, the words of each sentence, compares the first words of each sentence to see if there's something important using array commands, and then conditionally runs the rest of the code as required. And that is it. That is our code. Thank you for watching. I hope this made some sense. And that is done. Have a good day now.